as Jacob is leaving for Canaan. And as we do a very brief review over this, Jacob is now leaving for Canaan. He has decided to flee primarily because God has given him that directive, but also because living conditions with Laban have become very, very difficult because of the great wealth that Jacob has now acquired for himself, the tension within the family, the jealousy of his sons, the difficult situation that Laban himself has put upon Jacob because he's seen a transfer of wealth from himself to Jacob. Jacob has explained this decision to his wives, the appearance of God in a dream telling him that it's time to go, explaining to Jacob that there would be this transfer of possession through the manipulation of the breeding practices that God gave to Jacob in advance. The wives agree to this because they don't like living under the rule of their father who has mistreated them for all of their lives. They are willing to follow Jacob wherever he would take them. And so they have decided now to leave while Laban and his household are out shearing the sheep. This is a very extensive venture that they go on, likely taking at least 3 days or longer, depending upon the size of the flock. It takes place away from the house out in the fields, and this gives to Jacob and his family the ability to leave without being detected, which was necessary in Jacob's mind because he didn't believe for a moment that Laban would allow him to leave with his daughters and his grandchildren. So Jacob now leaves. He's in this large caravan with all of his possessions, moving towards his father's home. And Laban begins this pursuit of Jacob. Now we're told that after 3 days, Laban pursues, and it takes him 7 days to catch Jacob. And because of the length of distance that Jacob actually traveled, which by the map I showed you last time, I believe, it was about 400 miles, and there's no way that a caravan of Jacob's size could travel that far in 10 days. So experts tell us that these numbers of 3 and 7 are likely symbolic, meaning a shorter period and a longer period. Whatever that means, Laban has now caught up to Jacob, and he is ready to confront him. But before he does that, on the night that he camps out opposite of Jacob on opposing hills in the valley of Gilead, God appears to Laban in a dream for the sole purpose of warning Laban not to harm Jacob. I believe that's one of the most amazing things in this entire chapter, because God appears to Laban, who was not a worshiper of Yahweh, for the sole purpose of protecting Jacob. That ought to teach us something about the way God looks over his children, most especially Jacob in this period of his life. The next day, Laban confronts Jacob and makes these accusations against him. One, that he has deceived him. This deception means that he has stolen the heart of Jacob. He has deceived him in 2 ways: by taking his daughters away from him. And Laban says that Jacob has taken them away by force, by threat of the sword, which is not true, but that's the only way that Laban can reconcile in his mind why Rachel and Leah would ever decide to leave. But that's what Laban thinks, that Jacob has forced them to leave by threat of the sword. He also believes that Jacob has stolen his heart by depriving him of this proper farewell where a loving father would bless and kiss his daughters and his grandchildren and send them off with this big festive party. That's part of the delusion that Laban has about himself and who he thinks he is as he relates to his children and to his grandchildren. And then lastly, he accuses Jacob of stealing his household gods. That's probably the biggest and most offensive thing that Jacob could have done, was to steal the household gods that Laban placed great value in. So Jacob now makes his defense, and this is where we stopped off last week, and he explains to Laban that he left primarily because of, number one, fear. He left because of fear that there was no way that Laban was going to let him leave. He believed that Laban was going to force him to stay. He would not allow Rachel and Leah and the grandchildren to wander away with Jacob, and that would force Jacob to stay there. Secondly, Jacob protested his innocence. He knew that he had not stolen the household idols or gods that Laban had accused him of. He was so confident that he pronounced death upon anyone that would have stolen those idols, not knowing that his beloved Rachel had actually taken them. So confident in his innocence, he invites Laban to search all of his possessions for these household gods, and the one that is caught stealing these would be put to death. He also says that if you find anything of yours in my possessions, then I am guilty. So that's where we stopped, and we're going to continue in this outline. And because of the length of the passage we're going to complete today, we're going to read this as we go. And in the ongoing building of our outline, there's a mistake in there. Letter E is what should be there, is Rachel's ruse, which does not show up. It might show up in a minute. I readjusted this after the fact, so there are some mistakes in there. I apologize. Here the narrator is going to use a very skillful storytelling technique to build suspense as Laban is now searching for these household gods that have been stolen from his house. So verse 33, so Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two maids, but he did not find them. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. So Jacob is the chief suspect that Laban believes has stolen these household gods. So he searches there first, and then he goes into Leah's tent and then into the tent of the maids, believing that they would be a party to the stealing of these gods and would hide them on behalf of Jacob. And then lastly, he's going to go into Rachel's tent. But as he searches, Laban finds absolutely nothing. And now he's going to go into the least likely suspect, and that is into the tent of Rachel. It's probable that Rachel is his favorite because she is the most beautiful. And so verse 34 says, Rachel had taken the household idols and put them in the camel saddle, and she sat on them. And Laban felt through all the tent, but did not find them. So he has searched thoroughly, feeling through all the belongings, but he has found nothing because Rachel has hidden them under the saddle of her camel. It tells us something about the size of the idols and also something about the way that Rachel feels about these idols, that she would hide them in this manner. Now, in fear that her father would search her or would in fact search her camel, we see her ruse played out here in verse 35. She said to her father, let not my Lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of woman is upon me. So he searched but did not find the household idols, and that references the searching of her tent. So what Rachel does to trick her father is she feigned her menstrual cycle to avoid him searching her or the camel that she sat upon. Now, it was common in ancient cultures for women and the things that they touched to be considered unclean when they were menstruating. So this allows Rachel to conceal the gods that were hidden under the saddle that she sat upon. So by sitting on these idols and by feigning her menstrual cycle, Rachel is not only belittling these household idols, but this is a final parting shot at her father, who has treated her so poorly by arranging for her sister to marry Jacob and by keeping for himself the benefit of her marriage dowry that would have accumulated through Jacob working for Rachel for the 14 years that he did so. So this leads us into the next section, and that is Jacob's complaint and Laban's offer. This is the final subsection of this third major section that we're looking at, which will take us all the way down to verse 45. So in this section here, we're going to begin with Jacob's anger. Jacob's anger is over the false accusation that Laban has made against him, and he begins by asserting, number one, his innocence. We see this in verse 36 and 37. Then Jacob became angry and contended with Laban, and Jacob said to Laban, "What is my transgression? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? Though you have felt through all my goods, what have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that you may decide between us two." So the word anger here is a very strong word in the Hebrew, and it carries the idea of being incensed or being outraged. Jacob is on the verge of blowing his top. He is at his limit, and he is likely shouting at Laban, uncontrollably angry at the false accusations that he has made against him. To be hotly pursued means to be chased down with hatred, with bad intentions in mind. If you remember in the previous section that we read, Laban stood before Jacob and said, "I have the power to do you harm, but your God appeared to me in a dream and said, 'Do not harm Jacob.'" So Laban has hotly pursued Jacob with the intent to do him harm. So Jacob dares Laban with his kinsmen as witnesses to verify the accusations that have been levied against him, to find anything that has been stolen, knowing that the search has turned up nothing, and let these kinsmen be the judge between you and me about the accusations that you have made. At this point, Jacob turns the tables on Laban as he vents his outrage, and in the turning of the tables, he vents his outrage over, number one, his mistreatment. Mistreatment here is number two in the outline, but he's going to vent his anger over two different things. We see this in verse 38 and 39. These 20 years, think about that. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten the rams of your flocks. That which was torn of beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. You required it of my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. So this goes back to what we've already looked at. By Laban's own admission, Jacob had served him very, very well. Laban had acknowledged that his flocks had flourished under Jacob's care. What Jacob says here is that your flocks did not suffer great loss by miscarriage. It was very common when when sheep would give birth, that some would miscarry because they could not complete the birth, and the little lambs would die before they could complete the birthing process. And it was Jacob's attentiveness as a shepherd that would help pull these unborn lambs out of the mother, which would enable them to live. It was Jacob's attentiveness as a shepherd that would reduce the birthing deaths that Laban would have lost. So that's one thing that Jacob says, I have done very well for you, which has allowed your flocks to flourish. The other things that he says is that I did not feed myself from your flocks, which was not an uncommon thing that shepherds would do in this day. Additionally, it was typical that when shepherds would lose animals from animal attack, whether it be by day or by night, they would report that loss by bringing an animal carcass to the owner of the flock, and the owner of the flock would say, well, that's very unfortunate. They would potentially chastise them and say, keep a closer watch on the flock so this does not happen. But what the experts tell us that Laban did was that he forced Jacob to pay for whatever loss was incurred by the attack of wild beasts. That created an additional hardship for Jacob, who was paid very little for his care over the care of Laban's flocks. So this is what Jacob is protesting. I enabled your flocks to flourish, a lack of loss of life by birthing. I incurred the cost of any loss of life through the attack of wild beasts. And then he goes on to say that all of this I did under the typically harsh conditions of shepherding in the Middle East. Verse 40, thus I was by day the heat consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. We have no idea how difficult it was to be a shepherd in the Middle East. It was very, very difficult environmental conditions. Secondly, Jacob's outrage is over, number 3 in this section, his employment inequity. We see this in verse 41. Again, these 20 years I have been in your house, I have served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. So working 7 years to marry the wrong daughter, and then working an additional 7 years to marry the original daughter was an undue hardship that no one would have ever been expected to actually have to work for. And then these last 6 years working where you have changed my wages 10 times, constantly trying to take advantage of me, where you willfully mistreated me. Jacob says, these 20 years you have created this unfair employment contract with me. I have had it. You have done to me what never should have been done to an employee or a servant, let alone somebody who is flesh and blood. I am your nephew. I am outraged at these accusations you have made and the way you have treated me. Jacob contends that if it were not for God, Laban would have been successful in cheating him, even still leaving him with absolutely nothing. Look at what he says here in the conclusion of his anger in verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been for me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the toil of my hands, so he rendered judgment last night. So there's 3 things that are woven up in Jacob's conclusion of his argument here. The first thing is this: Jacob uses a new title for God that has not been used anywhere in Genesis, the fear of Isaac. It is, in a sense, a slang type of title for God. Some would translate this, the awesome one of Isaac. He will use this name a little bit later in this chapter. The second thing that we see here is that Jacob acknowledges that God alone has protected him and is the reason that he has survived and has any possessions at all. What he says here is that I would not have survived these 20 years under your employ had it not been for the fact that God has been with me. The third thing that Jacob says here is that God rendered judgment last night. And what that means is this: when God spoke to Laban in his dream and said, "You are not to harm Jacob," God stopped Laban from his true intentions, and in that sense, God judged between Laban and Jacob. God had declared that Jacob was justified in his departure and also justified in the accumulation of the great wealth, despite what Laban thought and what Laban desired. Had it not been for God appearing to Jacob in that dream, Laban either would have not let Jacob go, or had he caught Jacob in the valley, he would have harmed Jacob. So throughout all the 20 years that Jacob had been employed by Laban, God had been protecting him and providing for him. And the culmination of God's provision is seen in this showdown in the valley where Jacob is victorious. Now, letter B in the outline is Laban's compromise. We see this in verse 43. Then Laban replied to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, and the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All that you see is mine. But what can I do this day to these my daughters, or to their children whom they have borne?" Now, that's a very arrogant statement that Laban makes. And what Laban believes in his heart of hearts is that all of this really and truly belongs to him. What Laban means is all that is before him is in fact mine, and he has incredible bitterness at what Jacob has gained, and he claims that all of it has come from him. This is the basis of the dispute that exists between Laban and Jacob. Laban believes that Jacob is indebted to him because Jacob has become rich at Laban's expense. And conversely, Jacob believed that Laban owed him all of this because of the one-sided labor contract. And very clearly, from Jacob's perspective, God is on his side. I would say the proof is in the pudding, right? Laban's wealth has been transferred to Jacob because of the birthing arrangement that God manipulated sovereignly on Jacob's behalf because of the way Laban had been mistreating him. When Laban asks this rhetorical question, "What can I do this day?" he is acknowledging that his hands are tied. He has no recourse of action. He knows what God has declared in the dream, and his daughters are really and truly free to do whatever they please to do. Laban is admitting defeat, but he wants to salvage something. And so a solution is found here in verse 44. "So now come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me." This you and I, you and me, are the official invitations into number 7, the covenant that they are now going to embark upon officially as two parties. This is the fourth and final section of the chapter, which will take us all the way to the very end. So in this covenant, letter A, they are going to call upon the stone witnesses. Very unusual, something that is not totally uncommon in an ancient culture, is that these stones that they are going to put together are going to become the witnesses. We see this in verses 45 through 47. So Laban has called upon Jacob to embark upon making a covenant, and in response to that, verses 45 to 47, "Then Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar, and Jacob said to his kinsmen, 'Gather stones.' So they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap," beginning the covenant practice. Now Laban called it Jegar Sahadutha, but Jacob called it Galid. So in response to the suggestion of making a covenant, Jacob sets up a stone pillar, and his people, his servants, gather stones in a heap, and this pillar and this heap of stones will memorialize the treaty that is being made. In no way, shape, or form does Jacob believe that the pillar or the stones are now going to be an inhabitant of any kind of a deity. They just memorialize the covenant that is going to be made. Now, the two names here that are being used, Gilead or Jigar Sahadutha, are the names in the native tongue. The Aramaic transliteration sounds like Gilead or Gilead, and these names both mean a heap of stones. Imagine that. So that's what the names mean, a heap of stones. Letter B, they make the agreement, 48 and 49. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me this day." Therefore it was named Gilead. And Mizpah, for he said, "May the Lord watch between you and me when we are absent from one another." So here we see something interesting. Laban assigns a second name to the heap of stones. Not only one of location, Gilead, but one of function, Mizpah. Mizpah means watchtower. And Laban is calling upon the Lord to keep watch over them and the keeping of the covenant while they are separate from one another. Now, it's very bizarre that Laban would call upon the Lord Elohim because he is not a believer in Jacob's God. He uses a generic name for Lord, but in the Hebrew it is the name Elohim, not Yahweh. But he's calling upon the Lord to be a watchtower over them while they are away. Next, Laban asserts his concern for the care of his daughters. The function of the watchtower is to watch over Jacob and the care of his daughters, which provides a very comical irony considering how poorly Laban treated his daughters. But he wants God to watch over how Jacob is going to treat his daughters, since Jacob and his daughters are going to be away from the very caring, loving eyes of Laban the father. Verse 50. "If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take wives beside my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me." So Laban's primary concern here is that Rachel and Leah's children would stand to lose out on their future inheritance if Jacob were to take additional wives and they would give birth to future children. So future inheritance of children was always a common concern in ancient cultures because the birth of additional children would either jeopardize or it would water down the inheritance of the children of the father that these two daughters have now seen their grandchildren, or the children that their daughters have given birth to. So that was Laban's concern. If Jacob married other women and they gave birth to other kids, that would affect the inheritance of his natural grandchildren. So we also see here that the heap of stones will not only serve as a witness of the covenant, but it will also serve as a boundary marker in the future. Verse 51 and 52. Laban said to Jacob, "Behold this heap, and behold the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass by this heap to you for harm, and you will not pass by this heap and this pillar to me for harm." So Laban did not trust Jacob, and he needed assurances from Jacob that he was not going to have a change of heart and come after Laban in the future. Now, in truth, Jacob did not need to make a covenant. Why? Because God was on Jacob's side. God could take care of Laban anytime, any way, anyhow, without Jacob needing to do anything to Laban. But a covenant would establish a very clear separation between Laban and Jacob, between Laban's people and Jacob's people, and it would create a very clear distinction between these people groups, the Arameans and the future Israelites. Now, that's not an immediate concern, but it becomes a future concern when the nation of Israel is birthed through the descendants of Jacob in the future. Now that's important for Israel's history. Lastly, Laban solemnizes the covenant by calling upon deity to ratify their covenant. Letter C, the oath and the meal. So after the covenant is made, it's finalized by the oath and the meal. Verse 53. Laban solemnizes the covenant. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. You will note that Laban calls upon the God of Abraham, which would of course be Yahweh. That would be Jacob's God, the same one that appeared to Laban in a dream and warned him not to harm Jacob. But he also calls upon the God of Nahor. This is very likely the grandfather of Abraham, who was a worshiper of the moon gods of Ur, as was Abraham before he was called to follow God to the land that God would show him. So that was Abraham's God before his conversion. And Laban also calls upon the God of their father, which would have been Terah, who was a polytheistic worshiper, as was Nahor. So clearly, Laban is not a worshiper of Yahweh. He is still a worshiper of the moon gods, just like his father and grandfather and other ancestors were, which would be reflected most likely in the household gods that had been stolen that he was so interested in capturing, which is why he so hotly pursued Jacob. You will note here in the oath that Jacob only calls upon, again, the fear of his father Isaac, which is a clear indication that this is a reference to Yahweh. Lastly, verse 54, then Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called his kinsmen to the meal, and they ate the meal and spent the night on the mountain. So now they have made the oath and completed with another meal where both parties eat together, and now they camp on the same side of the mountain. The non-aggression pact has been completed, and Jacob will be able to move forward without worrying about Laban, and the 20-year saga of dealing with Laban is about to come to an end. Lastly, letter D is the farewell. Verse 55, early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his sons, his grandchildren, and his daughters, and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned to his place. So Laban now gets the proper farewell that Jacob's surprise departure deprived him of. He blessed them, meaning he wished them well, as he did his sister Rebekah when she departed with Isaac many years earlier when Laban went home. And so Laban was able to satisfy his delusional idea of being a loving father and getting this traditional proper farewell. He's now a loving grandfather, and he has blessed his grandchildren and sent them on, and he can return home believing that he has now fulfilled his proper duties. Jacob can now begin his journey to his father and to his homeland, and he knows that God has fulfilled his promises. God has been with him, God has protected him, and God has blessed him. And he is on the cusp of seeing his father and entering into his homeland once again. There's only one major obstacle before him, and that is his brother Esau, who 20 years earlier was breathing murderous threats against him. Now we're going to see how much of a major role this plays in Jacob's life. So this ordeal with Laban, especially the showdown in the valley, reminds me of a very important New Testament principle and a promise that we often forget. I want to read this. It's a very, very familiar verse, but we often don't read the following verses in the context. And I think it's essential that we do that. And I think it's very, very appropriate for understanding what it is Jacob has gone through and what it means for us today. Romans 28 through 31. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Here's where it really resonates. For those whom he foreknew, for also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? So God causes all of these things for the good of those who are called according to his purposes. Those whom he knew, he justified, he glorified. If God is for us, who is against us? This does not mean that no one will ever be against us, because we know that we experience regular and sometimes very aggressive opposition, just as Jacob did. But what it means is that no matter who is against us, God is for us. So in light of this, we need to evaluate the significance of the difference of the opposition that we face in light of the reality that God is for us. I'm going to read some words that R.C. Sproul said in support of this passage. I want you to listen to this. The importance of this declaration is simple. All the human opposition that rises against us is meaningless in the final analysis, because all the opposition in the world cannot overthrow the glory that God has laid up for his saints from the foundation of the world. If God is with us from all eternity, and if God is for us in his decree of election and effectual calling, and in justifying us by his grace, and if God is for us by glorifying every one of his people, then whose opposition can mean anything? Jacob was chosen by God to be a patriarch. His name is about to be changed from Jacob to Israel, and his children are going to become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. And compared to all of that, what does Laban's opposition really mean? It means nothing, right? But in the moment, what does Laban's opposition mean to Jacob? It means everything. It is life-changing. What does Esau's potential opposition mean to Jacob as he's about to make this next step? It means everything, but in light of the fact that Jacob is called to be a patriarch, and unbeknownst to Jacob, his 12 sons are going to become the 12 tribes of Israel. It means absolutely nothing. But what you and I lose sight of is the fact that from the foundation of the world, God has called us to be his children. Right? He has called us. He has glorified us. He has justified us. He has secured for us a place in heaven. So what does our temporary worldly opposition mean compared to that? So what does it mean when we're willing to venture in faith to follow him if somebody is going to oppose us? It means nothing. Because in the end, God is for us. And if in the end God is for us, then what does it mean that in between somebody or something can be against us? That should bolster our faith to follow God no matter what, no matter where he might lead us, no matter what we think the cost might be. Would you bow with me in prayer, please?